Augustine 20th, 4:36. The Remayan battalions that were stationed here to protect us left today. I didn't see them march away because I was baking bread this morning, but the patrons that were still in the fair had watched them go. Rather than head toward the enemy, they marched toward Starlo. To make matters worse, they destroyed the bridge crossing the river, trapping us here. When I first heard about the bridge, I didn't really want to believe them. As far as I hoped of my people, surely the military wouldn't leave us like that. However, the longer that I thought about it, the more I realized the stark truth of the matter. Those of us who had stayed behind had our chance to flee before, and we decided to remain behind. For some of the citizens, they couldn't run. As for me, I couldn't leave them behind. I also made the realization that in terms of strategy, destroying the bridge was the best tactic to protect the rest of Ramay from the Skenderite advance. However, in that same token, no reinforcements would be able to come and free us from what was coming. After my bread deliveries, I ran over to where the bridge used to be. There were still a dozen people standing where the remnants of the bridge stood. The bridge that had once spanned the Shrivaioli River had been a magnificent stone bridge that had been built during the reign of our third queen. It had taken 3 years to build, and yet in one morning, it had been destroyed. In the wee hours of the morning, I did recall hearing an explosion, although I thought it was a trick of the mind, as it sounded distant. The only sign that a bridge was there at all was the shattered stonework against the shore, and the broken visage across the Shrivaioli. I don't know how deep the river is, but I am aware that it is a little over a half-mile wide. The speed of the river had always been fairly rapid and dark brown. Ever since I was old enough to know names of things, I've heard it called the Muddy Shrivaioli. Now that same muddy Shrivaioli was the wall of a cage, trapping us with a starving beast. I tried to pay a visit to the mayor's office, but it was surrounded by the other concerned citizens like me. Mayor DeFranco wasn't taking visitors at the moment. Her aides promised an action plan was being developed and it would soon be revealed. I did what any sensible Remayan would do in that situation. I went home, baked some special bread for myself, poured a large glass of wine, and had a really good dinner. Zemez. Augustine 21st, 4:36. There was a town hall meeting, and of the 15,000 citizens Lafair previously had, we only had 4,300 or so. Most of the people in our communities had fled across the river when they had the chance. The mayor began the meeting by assuring us that she was going to do everything in her power to ensure as little damage to Lafair as possible. Regardless of strategy, the Queen of Ramay had abandoned us, but we still had to persist. We had to look after one another until Ramay could be freed. She charged us that despite us surrendering Lafair to the enemy, we must never surrender ourselves from being proud Ramayans. She would send a message to the approaching army to inform them that Lafair is surrendering, and to please be kind with their occupation. She didn't mention the bridge, and I wonder if such information should have been given. Then again, despite us being abandoned by the Queen, we were still Ramayans. Time would only tell how kind the Skenderites would be. Zemez. Augustine 22nd, 4:36. One thing is clear. The Ramayan forces who abandoned us are still across the river. Their individual patrol groups can still be seen at a distance, but the larger host isn't in sight. I was told about it while I went about my rounds, and I even confirmed it for myself after I had finished with my deliveries. I suppose their plan is to prevent any river crossing by the Skenderites. It's a bitter truth to swallow, knowing that our countrymen and countrywomen are close enough to see us be subjugated. There is still no word or sighting regarding the Skenderites. It would be a foolish daydream to imagine that they just went home. Every moment they don't show up is another moment that my insides twist into tight knots. We're still getting grain shipments to our mills, and I'm still getting my regular orders of flour for my bread. Each day bleeds into another, and it almost feels like my old routine. Then I look around me and see how empty my living room is, and how quiet the house is without Pita singing silly little songs. Aside from my own room, the other rooms are hollow shells of what they once were, devoid of the people who once brought life to this home. A deep and constant sorrow grips me, trying to choke me out. Still, I must linger on. I must never surrender. Zumez. Augustine 25th, 4:36. Like a silent, grim living nightmare, the Skenderites descended upon Lafair. I was in the middle of my bread delivery when I saw them, and when they saw me. They shouted at me to freeze as they approached, wearing their black-colored battle armors. Their weapons were drawn, and they stank of sweat and weary aggression. I was surrounded by 5 soldiers, their swords pointing at me. One of the officers approached me, a young man named Lieutenant Vitzo. He introduced himself to me, polite enough despite the fact that I was surrounded. And then he inspected my wagon. I showed him that all I hauled was bread, and he took a loaf from me. He ate some of it, and then actually smiled. It was a haunting expression, for it was the same sort of smile I might see from a neighborhood friend. It was the smile of a human, not a monster. Lieutenant Vitzo told me the bread was delicious, and he confiscated the rest of what I had in my wagon. My deliveries were spread among the soldiers in the crowd, as many as they could divide it. The lieutenant asked me if I was a baker, and I said I was. And he told me that he would be in contact with me very soon. He also asked me where the city hall was, and I was obliged to tell him. As soon as I was sent on my way, I went to the remaining patrons in my list and explained what had happened. I also promised to make more bread and deliver it later. An overwhelming aura of dread wrapped around me as the streets of Lafair had become filled with Skenderite soldiers. I lost track of how many I counted while I traveled back home. I could only assume that 3 or 4 battalions had made their way into our sweet Lafair. As soon as I got back inside, I began working on the replacement bread, if for nothing else but to distract me from the outside world. Luckily, only 6 baskets had been taken. However, when I tried to leave, I was stopped by a patrol. I had to ultimately bribe them with all of the other bread I had made that day to be allowed to make these deliveries. The Skenderites had a pair of soldiers ride around with me to ensure I was nothing more than a baker. I returned after my deliveries to find the same soldier who stopped me before. He told me that I was not allowed to leave my home tomorrow until Skenderite leadership said it was okay. I managed to bake one more round of bread for myself, as the Skenderites ate all of the other food I had. I hope my parents and Pita are okay. Zumez. Augustine 28th, 4:36. Just an update. I have not been permitted to leave, nor has anyone been allowed to visit me. Or rather, Remains have not been allowed to visit me. Skenderite soldiers banged on my door and they asked me, not so nicely, about whether or not I had any bread. They took it all, and obviously didn't pay. In addition to all of that, they told me to make more bread for tomorrow. Squads of troops constantly moved throughout the city. Surely by now they know about the bridge. That would have been a first-day discovery. I can only fathom what they have planned for Lafair. September 2nd, 4:36. I woke this morning and started my routine. But before I could even put the bread in the oven, I received a hard knock on my door. As soon as I answered the door, Lieutenant Fizzo walked inside, along with 2 armed soldiers. He asked to inspect my facilities, and so I allowed him to do so. He questioned me about my regular clientele, and then inquired about how much bread I could make during the morning. Despite the fact that the Skenderites were the occupying force on the fair, Lieutenant Fizzo was pleasant, if not a little formal. Still, I squirmed under his presence. I'm not a soldier or a warrior, and thus I entertain no illusion about my ability to successfully punch the man in the face without being foiled and then killed after. Still, I kept my answers short, crisp, and yet as passive as I could, by preventing me from leaving my home for the last 8 days. There were patrons who were made to go without our fresh bread. Lieutenant Fizzo explained to me, much in the manner a teacher would address a class, that the Skenderites had taken complete control of the city. Our mayor, Latrice DeFranco, was still doing normal functions of city administration, but she reported directly to the highest-ranking Skenderite officer, a woman named General Olisha Wassendorf. The lieutenant explained that I was allowed to resume my deliveries, as the mayor had validated my family's service to Lafair. However, all of the bakers, butchers, and other food providers had to supply provisions to the Skenderite military first. Of course, Lieutenant Fizzo said I would be provided with enough flour to make hundreds of loaves, and anything left over was for me to use on my whim. While I'm not being paid during the occupation, I would be given raw materials. Essentially, I was to make 6 deliveries for the Skenderites, 1 to each of the established barracks for the soldiers, and 1 to the mayor's office, where General Wassendorf and her advisors were living. The lieutenant told me to start immediately, and then left me with more than enough bags to bake their request. The sooner I finish this order for the damned Skenderites, the sooner I can get the much-needed bread to my people. I cannot fight, but at least I can feed. Zemez. September 15th, 4:36. The days blend together when nothing ever changes. Every morning I wake up a couple of hours before dawn and I begin the process of bread making. I make my deliveries to each of the 5 barracks and the command center, which was once City Hall. The Skenderites have set up checkpoints throughout the city, and at each of the checkpoints, a group of 4 Skenderites halt citizens and demand to see their papers. Shortly after the reopening of Lafair, as it were, the Skenderites went through the city and took detailed notes about who each of the citizens were, what they could do, and whether or not they had weapons, armor, or contraband. Those who had essential jobs were allowed to continue to practice their roles in order to secure the Skenderite warfront. Those who didn't have essential jobs were put on labor details. Rather than be paid with coin, people were paid in food and were allowed to keep on living. How considerate of these invaders to allow us to live and eat. My travel papers allowed me to move more freely than most, but other people had restrictions on which zones of Lafair they were allowed to visit. There was also a sunset curfew set in place, where no one was allowed on the streets after dark, unless they were Skenderite patrols. Anyone caught out past curfew would be either denied food rations or imprisoned. As many Remains fled Lafair before the bridge was destroyed, many buildings were left vacant. I can't say it was quite benevolent, But the general only had vacant homes serve as lodging for the Skenderite soldiers. Whenever I delivered my bread to each of the 5 barracks, I often took at least 500 mini-loaves to the designated offices for each of the residential areas. When I first started my rounds, I made fewer, larger loaves. But as soon as I switched to the smaller, more numerous ones, it seemed to go over better with our captors. However, I didn't switch over to the smaller loaves just for the sakes of our unwelcomed occupants. After a week of making the Skenderites bread, I decided to do something a little subversive. I began taking 1/4 of the flour given to me by the Skenderites and stockpiling it in a back room. Then I started using different baking techniques to make smaller, airier loaves to cheat the damned Skenderites. It's from this secret stash that I made last-minute and end-of-the-day deliveries to my patrons. My patrons and I had set up a system where they snuck through alleyways, and I parked my wagon by a secluded, unsupervised alleyway. My patrons are able to come and get enough food to last them for a few days, all at the expense of the Skenderites. I have been lucky enough to be able to do this every day, and no one is the wiser. I cannot fight, but I can do this. My people are able to continue resisting and surviving, and for that, I can find purpose. My last delivery for the Skenderites is always the command center. There are always guards stationed at the entrances of the building, with multiple patrols moving around its perimeter. The guards at the front always ask for my papers, even though they see me every day. Mayor DeFranco has been lowered to that of a greeter and a front desk receptionist, and she welcomed me dryly upon my entering. It was to my understanding that she was still helping with some of the municipal activities, but General Valsendorf was quite active in governance in Lafair. I was always directed to take the bread to the kitchen, a room that the Skenderites had built shortly after their occupation. However, I'm also supposed to take 2 special loaves and leave them on top of the general's desk. While walking to the office located on the 2nd floor, Mayor DeFranco's former office, I had to stroll past a pair of Skenderite guards at the foot of the stairs. I also have to pass by the conference room, where General Vossendorf often meets with her staff for briefing meetings. I never lingered in the hallways, for that would have been foolish and raised unnecessary questions. After my last delivery, I always allowed myself to walk past the road that used to lead to the bridge. The Skenderites have been building structures where ferries could be constructed. The process was still slow going as the Remain army had showed their presence, waiting on the other side of the Shrievioli. Early in September, I even got the chance to witness a failed attempt to cross the river, where the combined forces of the Remain and Baton armies rained down fire arrows on the Skenderite ferries. I managed to hear slivers of information from overheard conversations, from Skenderite soldiers, and from people on my delivery route about the war. To my understanding, the Skenderites have decided to establish fortifications along the river, both to prepare to cross in the near future, and also to prevent some kind of counterattack or counteroffensive. Unfortunately, even seeing how the Remains and Batons have been maintaining a safe distance from the fair, I honestly doubt they'll ever try to retake the city. As far as I can tell, there are at least 5,000 Skenderite troops stationed here. My countrymen and countrywomen destroyed the bridges across the Shrievioli, although doing so has allowed for legions of Skenderite warships to sail up and down the river. The river flows into Baton, and many Skenderites have been deployed downriver. As for Sortig, I've heard that the Skenderite forces focus on that front. The battles there are so fierce, and ground is lost or gained by the mile. In the Weeb Sea, I hear there are many naval battles there too. The Remain and Baton fleets are doing their best to prevent landfall. The world is clenching so tightly. Too bad we're on the wrong side of the river. Zumez. 'Tis 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 ' Octobrine 15th, 436. Just a minor update. Nothing new to reveal about the war. It seems all the fronts have been fortified to the point of an all-stop to the Skenderite war machine. The lightning nature of their impressive advancement has finally ceased, and the momentum is starting to evaporate rapidly. The autumn is so beautiful, but no one is allowed to leave the city. We can only witness the beauty of the trees from afar. The only exceptions to the rule are the farmers who bring in the grain. I never get to see them, though, because they have to be searched by the Skenderite checkpoints and the grain inspectors. We as Remains are always watched. And even I have weekly inspections on my bakery. Luckily, my father built a secret room in one of the bedrooms, which is essentially a secret extra closet. Sometimes it's hard to imagine a time when we were free, far from the clutches of war. What's even harder is to imagine what Lefer will look like when all of this is over. Zumez. Decembrine 1st, 436. It's been a couple of months since I wrote last in this journal. The remainder of Octobrine and Novembrine flew by as the days and nights blend together in a long and unyielding nightmare tapestry draped along the halls of history. Had it not been for the first snow of the year, I'm sure I would have stumbled through the same steps I trudged through the day before. It's strange to see the streets of Lefer empty, coated in snow, with only the oppressive and unwelcome visages of the Skenderite patrols making tracks in the unbroken alabaster fluff. Thank the goddess that there aren't any children left in Lefer. Everyone with a child had left, and so little eyes were spared from seeing our beloved city infested so. Winter has always been Gwenda's favorite, and she loved the crisp internal feeling when one drew in a deep winter breath. Trudging through the wet snow to deliver bread was invigorating, but I got to witness how quiet and hollow Lefer had become. It was never meant to be like this. Based on my observations, the Skenderites are settling in for the winter, rather than trying to push forward. It seems that the world is finally given a brief reprieve. The winter solstice is coming at the end of the month, and it will be the saddest one I have ever had. I am fairly certain that will be the date of my next entry. Unless the Remain military somehow makes a massive surge across the river. Zumez. Decembrine 21st, 436. Happy winter solstice! Even as I write those words, my heart is threatening to rip out of my chest. My house is depressingly silent, but I can hear the sounds of passing patrols. They're talking about the parties being held at other fortifications in the city, and how excited they are to attend after their shifts. The Skenderites celebrate, but we as Remains aren't allowed to. I'm aware that smaller groups huddled together before curfew started, and they shared company with one another. I wasn't invited to any secret gatherings. Not that I could go even if I wanted to. I have to bake the bread. Otherwise, people don't eat. I simply can't let that happen. My downstairs, and the majority of my corner of the world, is as cold and isolating as the streets outside. I think of my parents and Pita, and hope that they're safe and warm in Starlow, or at least as far from this war as possible. I also think of Gwenda, whom I hope is with me in spirit, or waiting for me when I finally breathe my last. Damn the Skenderites and their aggression. We didn't want this. We just wanted to be left in peace and have our beloved land free of war. Damn them. Damn them to hell. Zumez. Decembrine 31st, 436. Today is the last day of this year. Please, Goddess, please let this war end in 437. Please guide the remains back to freedom. Zumez.